Good afternoon all. Thank you very much for joining. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to let a few more people join and then we'll get started. Sorry, anyone else who's just joined, we're just going to give it another minute, just let a few more people in, and then we'll go and get started. Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining, and welcome to our 11th Alinea Forum and the third virtual instalment of the event. I'm Harvey Stead, Project Surveyor at Alinea Consulting and your producer for the evening. And I'll provide you with a quick overview of today's session before introducing the presenters and passing you over to our expert panel to begin the session. So this 11th instalment of the Alinea Forum will focus on the WELL standard from an occupier's perspective, following the Building Magazine article that was issued towards the end of 2019, with input from this panel. So this will cover what the WELL standard actually is, focusing on the tangible benefits of implementing a wellbeing strategy, considering the business cases and the cost of implementation, reflecting on actual case studies, and then we'll finish off with a Q&A session. So this evening's panel is made up of Gordon Graham, Chris Allen, and Chris Laleys from Alinea Consulting, along with Simon White from Cundall and Danny Hall from the Crown Estate, who will provide some insight into their experience and view on WELL from an occupier's perspective. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A panel to the side of your screen, and we'll have a few minutes at the end just to run over a few of these. So without further ado, I will now pass you over to Chris to begin the session.
Thanks, Harvey. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see this. Okay, so welcome to our forum on WELL from an occupier's perspective. So just to sort of set the scene, I guess, we're incredibly privileged to work with some top clients, and amongst them being Lipton Rogers and the Crown Estate. Now, in many ways they differ as organisations, but I think in my opinion, three attributes that connect them are that both organisations are forward-thinking, both organisations are passionate about sustainability and wellbeing, and both organisations are unquestionably successful at what they do. So to sort of what led us here in terms of, I guess, how we've encountered WELL. First of all, I think our first WELL project was 22 Bishopsgate with Lipton Rogers, which was well enabled, and then we worked with the Crown Estate on number 1 St James's Market, which ultimately achieved WELL Platinum certification. And interestingly, that's also how we got to knowing Danny and Simon, who are our guests on the panel today. If we cast our minds back a little bit, Alinea published an article back in 2017, which was on WELL Core. That focused predominantly on the version 1 and WELL from a sort of a shown core enablement basis. And then off the back of our experience with the Crown Estate, we decided to follow that article up with an article on WELL from an occupier's perspective, focusing more so on the fit out, and that was on version 2 of the standard. This is the article we produced. It makes for riveting reading, I can assure you, so when you get the chance, by all means. So the usual format for these forums, we'd normally hold them in our office at 90 Cannon Street. For those of you who've been before, you'll recognise the format. And we thought it'd be a really cool idea to do some live environmental modelling, monitoring with Cundall's equipment, just to sort of as a test case to see how the temperature, humidity, CO2 fluctuated whilst occupying the room. However, with the change of backdrop and the success of the online webinars, here we are. So just to introduce you to our panelists today, so Simon and Danny are both guest speakers. Just to start off with Simon. Simon leads Cundall's Building, Physics, Health, Wellbeing and Sustainability team. He's a member of the UK Green Building Council's Members Advisory Committee, the British Council for Officers BCO Environment, Social and Governance Group, ESG, and chair of the CIBSE Knowledge Generation Panel. He has authored numerous papers and presents at national and international conferences on net zero carbon, health and wellbeing, and UN Sustainable Development Goals. Over the last few years, he's delivered the first WELL certified projects in both Europe and MENA. He has been instrumental in helping develop net zero carbon and whole life carbon definitions and methodologies for the Greater London Authority and the Construction Industry Council of Hong Kong. Moving over to Danny. Danny has over 25 years of experience in the services engineering sector, focusing on occupiers' comfort and well-being. Danny has always pushed for engineering excellence and is interested in how technology plays a part in the future of building performance. Danny is head of engineering at the Crown Estate, but joins the Crown from Lipton Rogers, where he's been working predominantly on 22 Bishopsgate. He has extensive design and technical experience, having worked for major consultancies, at WSP and Norman Disney Young, working on a number of major projects, including the Angel Building, 52 Lime Street and Television Centre, as well as 22 Bishopsgate. His focus on well-being alongside integrating new technologies and sustainable solutions across his projects. Other panellists include Gordon Graham, who is a partner at Alinea. He heads up the workplace team. Chris Laleys, who's an SPS at Alinea and had a large involvement in the collaborative piece between Cundall and ourselves to understand the pathway to achieving well. And myself, Christopher Allen, I'm an associate and I had an active involvement in the article also. Sorry, my light's just gone out. So just to talk through the running order for the day, we'll start off with an overview of the WELL building standard. We'll follow that up with benefits to the occupiers and the business case. We'll talk a little bit about collective experience, which will be run by Gordon with the other panelists. We'll talk a little bit about cost considerations and our cost model and how we approach that. Cundall will then take over and do a presentation on productivity, mapping and wellbeing, and then we'll finish up with some Q&A. So, as we discovered, there's a lot more to wellbeing in the workplace than just a couple of carefully placed plants. In fact, you can find evidence reaching back as far as 2001 with our friend David over at Wernham Hogg, clearly paving the way. And with best intentions, people are trying, but not always hitting the mark. And you can see some good examples there. But there are also some good examples of well-executed wellbeing strategies, and this we'd like to see more of. So in a backdrop of rating systems, the WELL building standard has really focused our minds as it covers more well-being focused attributes than any of the other sustainability systems. And I mean, if you look at the BCO Wellness Matters report, it measures against 55 wellbeing outcomes. It becomes apparent that WELL really majors on the wellbeing side and others less so, where perhaps they focus more on the sort of building sustainability side. Building Green has also produced a similar chart comparing the systems based on health related priorities, suggesting the same thing, which is that the WELL building standard has a really heavy focus on wellbeing. But certification or not, it has opened our eyes to the potential benefits of implementing a wellbeing strategy in the workplace. So just a little bit about WELL Core versus WELL certification for those of you who don't know. So WELL Core, in simple terms, it sort of concerns itself with the base build, and i.e. the shell and core, whereas WELL certification focuses predominantly on the occupier side, the fit out. There are some exceptions to that rule, but on the most part, that's the difference. And in terms of version 1 versus V2, so in 2018, version 1 was superseded by version 2. 7 of the concepts, so these are on the chart here, it shows the concepts down the left hand side. There were 7 that remained the same, but they introduced 3 new concepts, being materials, communities and innovation, and thermal was split down into thermal and sound. And those 10 concepts, and for some reason, unbeknownst to me, innovation isn't classed as a concept, but they're comprised of roughly 120 sub-features, which are, and of those 120, 23 are preconditions, so they're mandatory. So in order to achieve WELL certification, you have to hit those those conditions, with the remainder being optimizations. And so essentially they're optional, and they sort of, you can pick and choose your pathway to achieving well. One of the sort of pieces of feedback that we've received is that V2 is generally considered more flexible than V1 because there are less preconditions, i.e. mandatory ones, but more optimizations. And just a little reminder, so you can see on the chart there, you've got 14 features against air, and they've all got different point scorings, but just to put it into perspective, in order to achieve silver you need 50 points, gold 60, and platinum 80. And I think it's also worth reminding ourselves how far we've come looking back. The Taylorism, the management theory, that also known as scientific management, where it sort of studied how work was performed and then how that affected worker productivity. Taylor's philosophy centered around the belief that optimizing the way the work was done would be more efficient than making people work as hard as they could. And in fact, there might be some people listening to this who remember working in places such as this. But moving forward, here we are. I'm sure there'll be mixed opinions around the suitability of slides in the workplace or sleeping pods sending the wrong message. But what I guess there can be no question about is that the workplace is embarking on a period of radical change. So, whilst undertaking the research for this article, we discovered a lot of publications and papers out there. I won't confess to have read them all, but what I did discover is that there's a common theme, and that being that there's a direct correlation, or the conclusions from most were that there was a direct correlation between well-considered workplaces and good environmental conditions with enhanced user experience and increased productivity. I'll just let you sort of digest some of those statements there, but clearly they're not to be ignored. So prior to undertaking this article, I'd really just sort of seen the well building standard and well-being as just making a pleasant place for people to work. I didn't really appreciate the business side of it, the business case. So I attended a seminar which run by Kundal back in 2019 on productivity mapping, and it really opened my eyes to the link between well-being, productivity, and the bottom line. And in fact, the World Green Building Council, they suggest that staff costs account for approximately 90% of a business's operating costs overall, and that position is broadly confirmed by the BCO, suggesting that 85% of operating costs relate to staff. So with people being the engine room for most businesses, it would make sense that that is the best place to invest and improve. So when we look at the business case, we'll be looking at sort of 5 key headings. We'll be looking at the employee, so what the employee wants. We'll talk a little bit about absenteeism, which is essentially sickness from work, spending time at home. Productivity and presenteeism, so that's more focused on being in work but not really being there. Might be due to being under the weather or just not motivated. We'll look at staff turnover and churn, and also mental health. So if we start with the employee, what do people want? The Future Workplace study back in 2019 surveyed 1,600 people working in corporate office environments. In fact, they coined the phrase the workplace triple threat: air, light, and temperature. So when asked which factors most affected their performance, happiness and well-being, air quality, comfortable light, and water and temperatures were rated highest. Savills then run a similar survey. They do this, I think, annually, and it's called What Workers Want. And they surveyed 11,000 participants across 11 European countries. And comfort of work area, followed by air quality and temperature and lighting, were clearly the big ticket items. So I think what we can see here is a bit of a theme emerging. And interestingly, what were people most dissatisfied with? Well, people were most dissatisfied with air quality, temperature, comfort of work area. These themes sort of keep reappearing. So we ran a few sort of test scenarios just to see how these claims, these productivity improvements might impact on a business's bottom line, just out of interest. So first of all, we looked at absenteeism. Now, if you factor in annual leave, that's your sort of green dots there. So I'm assuming 25 days a year, and then you've got your public holidays. So the rest of the time there is essentially, possible productive days. And if we look at some of the research out there, it suggests that between 4 and 6 days per employee per year accounts for the absenteeism. So essentially, we're losing between 4 and 6 days a year because people are falling ill or unable to work, and that equates to about 2%, which doesn't sound like a great deal, but in sort of monetary terms, we ran the analysis. So we took a theoretical business case of 100 staff, and just for those of you that are interested, that's what 100 staff looks like, or thereabouts. And we assumed an output of 150 grand per year per fee earner. And I must add, this is definitely not a linear that we're basing it on. But 4 to 6 days of lost productivity could equate to between 270 and 400 grand of unharnessed fees per year. So clearly, expecting to reach zero is probably unrealistic, but based on pre and post occupancy evaluations, where we had sight of average improvements of 30% not being unrealistic, in output terms, that equates to between 1 and 2 days per year per fee earner, or a saving of between 80 to 120,000 pounds per year. Productivity and presenteeism, that's a little bit more difficult to assess, but the research seems to suggest that between 2 and 3 times more of greater impact than absenteeism. So clearly, this one's potentially has huge repercussions. Some of the research suggests improvements of 14% productivity just based on improved CO2 conditions alone. So, and that's ignoring relative humidity, temperature, daylight, and acoustics. So by the time you factor all of those into it, you can see it starts to grow. So in staff turnover, not necessarily a negative indicator, because some staff churn is to be expected, but depending on the source, it can range between 5 and 15%. So with estimated costs to the business ranging between 33 and 200% of an employee's salary, Oxford Economics suggested an average of 31k per head, with the majority of which associated with lost productivity, taking 28 weeks to embed a new member of staff. So back to our scenario, with an average cost of 31k per employee, this suggests a potential cost to a theoretical business case of between 155k and 465k. Again, looking at the pre and post occupancy surveys, improvements of 27% we found. So in theory, that could equate to between 40 and 125,000 pound per year against staff turnover costs alone. And then we'll finish up with mental health. So based on our research, we discovered the largest cause of long-term absence is mental ill health. And that's followed closely by stress. And I think, beyond the obvious legal and ethical aspects, poor mental health comes at a huge cost to employers. And the studies seem to draw strong connections between mental health, biophilic design, and good nutrition, not to mention the human connection that is facilitated in a workplace designed for well-being. So next, I'll hand you over to Gordon Graham, who will do this interactive Q&A with Simon and Danny.
Thanks a lot, Chris. As you outlined, we're going to use the next part of the forum to do some discussion with our specialists and our guests around not only their experience of delivering projects, but really try to focus in on their experiences of actually living in buildings and their offices being well accredited. We touched on it earlier. In 2018, the Crown Estate's headquarters achieved WELL Platinum, and in 2016, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but Cundall's was the first building to achieve the WELL building standard in Europe at your One Carter Lane headquarters.
Correct, and we're just going through the recertification process now, because you have to recertify every 3 years with WELL. So we'll be the first, I think, outside of America to recertify.
Great. So with those specific real life experience in mind, I'm just going to sort of open the floor to some dialogue with yourselves around your experiences to date. So first question, and it's pretty open to both of you, but I think we'll maybe start with Danny. But from experience to date, what is the key piece of feedback that you've received from your clients and tenants, more importantly, who occupy well, who incorporate well into their projects?
I think tenants need to understand what they want first of all. I think, Gordon. I think there's an early engagement here that people are sort of missing out on. And if you get in early and get a good engagement into the specification, this thing can be relatively straightforward. I think once they're in the building, I think all the feedback is very positive. We're in a well platinum building ourselves. People love the biophilia in there. It really sort of energizes people. The air quantities and air qualities. People sort of thrive in it really. So the feedback from tenants and clients is good. But I would say, to get the process a little bit smoother, I think it's about early engagement and getting the specification dialed in pretty early in the process.
Simon, what about yourself? What would be the key takeaway that you get from revisiting projects with your clients sort of 6 months, 12 months down the line?
I think the biggest thing is the engagement piece. So we've been in our building now for 4 years. When we moved in, everyone really liked the natural lighting connection. They felt that the air quality was better because there wasn't that new building smell which you get with VOCs and toxins associated with some more aggressive products, so going for more natural products. But what we found is probably the biggest impact is really that engagement piece, and that's where WOW's really strong. It doesn't just look at the physical features, it looks at how you interact with the staff, your policies, how you operate as a business. And people who hadn't done exercise in 10, 20 years started taking up running, setting up running clubs, having fitness classes within the space, really thinking about their own well-being. And that's the real benefit. And what we've seen with clients where we're going in and installing things like air quality monitoring devices, the day we install the air quality device, actually we get a positive response from the occupants. So someone actually caring about their well-being, they respond to positively, even though we haven't done anything to improve the air quality, just monitoring it, you get a bounce. So people like the fact that someone is taking an interest in them personally and investing in their well-being.
Great, thanks. Danny, with specific focus to your role, both past and present, what are the main challenges that you see when you set out to make a building well enabled?
I guess when we looked at Bishopsgate, it's a pretty well specified building in the first place. So actually taking that to a well standard actually wasn't that difficult because we'd made some good design choices on the way to that. So we had good amount of air, we had good lighting. Some of the other things that were quite tricky actually were more about timing of testing and that sort of thing and certification. I guess one of the difficulties specifically on that project were around VOC testing and how that interacted with tenants' fit-outs going on in the building. Lots of work being done on various floors, but how we were going to get that testing done was quite tricky. We had one tenant who was open to a common part of the building, so we had to encourage those their design teams and their sort of clients to adopt a well standard, so it didn't risk our well standard because of what they did. So there was a bit of a sort of partnering arrangement in there. I think again, there's some sort of almost light-hearted things around reduction of salt and sugar for food and beverages. Where do you put the no smoking signs? They're all tricky but light-hearted in many ways.
The small bowls was always one that stuck with me. Smaller bowls for smaller portions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting ones, isn't there? But I think it goes back to what Simon was saying. Actually, we put some encouragement, I suppose, in the escape stairs to encourage people to use the stairs instead of lifts, and that sort of thing had great feedback from the tenants actually, and actually, I think they'll get well used, and it wasn't super expensive stuff, and actually I think we enjoyed it as the developers, and I think the tenants will enjoy that too. So yeah, there's lots of things, but I think if there's a well-designed building from the start, it's perhaps not as difficult as people might think.
Mm-hmm. And moving forward into your new role, how do you see the Crown Estate's strategy for well evolving going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, similar to the previous question, to be honest, Gordon. I mean, we're not a sort of tick box exercise company. We're not sort of led by certification in our buildings, and I think we've got a good understanding of what a good quality building is, and that changes through time. So we've done a few buildings now with a well standard, and that hasn't, we haven't necessarily used it as a sort of measurement tool. We've used it as a design tool, and we've baked some of the requirements into our DSP, which is our sort of briefing document, if you like. So once you've done that, and your specification reflects that in the early days, it's then about can that particular building, we've got a lot of small and refurbishment projects on the estate, so can we actually do it with that project? But the ambition at the Crown is to produce really good quality buildings, and I think that's borne out by our design guidance and some of the stuff we've done on St James's Market and Hedden Street. We're really ambitious in the field.
Thank you. Simon, your remit and role is very broad and far-reaching, well beyond the Well Initiative. Across your sort of field of expertise, is there any other industry initiatives or accreditations that you see either complementing or hindering the evolution of Well?
It's an interesting one. We've had a very strange last decade with sustainability, with probably over the last 4 or 5 years, the significant rise of health and wellbeing as the forefront of what people have been focused on. At one point, every single conference was focused on or health and wellbeing, and there seemed to be huge appetite for health and wellbeing. There's a number of other schemes, including Fitwell, which look at health and wellbeing, and they're gaining traction in the market. It was actually getting probably unhealthy because it was pushing all other sustainability agenda out. But over the last 2 years, you've probably noticed the rise of traditional sustainability again, with the Blue Planet, the rise of the interest in single-use plastics, and obviously the climate emergency and the drive now towards net zero carbon. And what we found interesting over the last 5 years is, as you say, there's 105 features. All of those can be delivered sustainably or unsustainably. A good example is the amount of fresh air supplied into a building. Health and wellbeing is generally linked to the amount of available fresh air, but if we double the amount of ventilation into buildings, it increases fan energy by eight times. So what we're looking at is how we move air around effectively in buildings instead of just flooding buildings with air, and using smart controls. So I see smart, net zero carbon and health and wellbeing as the central pillars to most offices' design, and how we integrate the three together is going to be really important going forward.
I think that's a really good summary, and with that thought of moving forward and going forward, and as the UK workforce returns to work, how do you foresee those points influencing the return to work strategy?
Well, there's two issues here. There's the short term and the long term. So there's lots of guidance which I've been involved with CIBSE and the BCO on how to manage buildings at the moment, and it's really all about ventilation to dilute the air. So there's requirements to open windows where possible, run ventilation for longer periods, extended periods, sometimes even 24 hours. Remove any recirculation and really just focus on the air quality and how much dilution you can get because of the airborne transmission risk. But obviously that's having an impact on energy consumption if you run your ventilation for 24 hours. So a lot of these responses hopefully will be short term, and then we can go back towards focusing on net zero carbon. There will be some long-term interventions, things like contactless entrance, more focus on destination control, use of materials which don't harbour bacteria for longer periods, easier cleaning, and also a complete move towards more flexible working, which we were seeing before COVID, but it's really accelerated. We probably moved forward 5 years with COVID on more flexible working, more adaptive working as we go forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. I think it's on that point. I'd just like to move the conversation on to my colleague Chris Lallis, who's going to be presenting some of the commercial considerations. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. In order to give a view on costs, we teamed up with Cundall and carried out a series of collaborative workshops to learn about the requirements for each of the features. The Well standard has since launched version 2, and we decided it would be interesting to compare the cost of achieving Well Interiors Gold to a typical £100 a square foot Cat B London-based office fit-out. We chose a set of features that we would include, which we've shown as a range of an additional £3 to £8 a square foot of NIA. It's important to note that this will vary depending upon the specific features targeted and project specifics, but it's intended to give a feel for the order of costs. This diagram breaks down the costs by concept and shows their respective impact on the construction cost. The most significant concept from a cost perspective was air, followed by thermal comfort and water. The air concept includes air quality monitoring and low VOC finishes, which has become a hot topic in recent years due to the levels of pollution recorded in major cities around the world. It's important to note that this is for construction cost only, and so excludes items like furniture, professional fees and operational costs. There are also features which are entirely project specific, such as availability of local amenities and daylight requirements. I'm going to pass you over now to Simon Wyatt of Cundall to talk through productivity mapping.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just share my screen. So I'm going to take you through our journey in health and wellbeing, which we've kind of been on for the last 6 years when we discovered the wellbeing as part of our One Planet initiative, looking at the health and happiness of our employees and how we could improve that when we moved office in London. And off the back of that, we've spoken at lots of conferences and authored lots of papers. And whenever we do anything, the first question we get asked is, that seems to be all well and good, but what's the cost and what's the benefit to us? So over the last couple of years, we've really focused on actually making that business case and explaining what the benefits are compared to the actual capital costs. And as we heard earlier, one of the biggest drivers is really the war for talent. The reason a lot of people invest in their offices is to attract that talent. Most organisations, when polled what the biggest risk to their business is attracting and retaining that talent in the organisation. And they're willing to spend significant amounts of money. Like traditionally, the best graduates went out into the market and went into the finance sector, into banking. Over the last decade, that's really moved towards the tech, the likes of Google, your Facebooks. And partly the way they've done that is the quality of their workspace and also the corporate environment they create. It's no longer a stuffy banking environment. It's a much more dynamic, innovative, creative environment. And what we're seeing is the rest of the industry really try and catch up. Banking, law are all changing their setups to be more like the tech companies. The way that we've kind of gone through this journey over the last few years, we started with the well-building standard, as we've heard quite a lot about recently, and we've applied that now to 80% of the projects that have been certified here in the UK. So we've learned quite a lot from doing those projects. Looking at the One Carter Lane back in 2016, then moving on to the Crown Estate where we helped achieve Well Platinum in 2018-19. We also have worked on the only 2 Shell and Core buildings in the country that are certified, which included the Porter building, which was in Slough, which let in the first month, even though the rest of the industrial estate is still semi-let, and it sold for a significant profit. And the main focus of that was the wellness programme. And then they've obviously seen a huge interest in co-working over the last decade. And we've seen a big fight between the co-working providers on health and wellbeing as credentials, and working with one provider. We've actually now certified to platinum, or just going through the final certification for platinum, which will be the first co-working space in the world that's certified to platinum. So we're hoping that will attract tenants into that space, especially with the fears around COVID and transmission. It's also not just offices. We've seen it move into other sectors, shared accommodation and PRS, but more interestingly, it's moved into retail. With the death of the high street, people are looking for experience, and that experience is accentuated by wellness, and there's a lot of requests for prices out at the moment which have a real focus on health and well-being for the fit out of units. But over the last couple of years, what we've really seen and been most interested is being the performance in use. What we like about WELL compared to things like LEED and BREEAM is it's not about the design standard. You still have to go through the design process and collect the evidence. But with WELL, they come and test your performance on site. If you don't achieve that performance on the day, you do not get certified. Just to caveat that, it has caused a few issues on timescales. People think that you can get certified a couple of months after PC, like you do with BREEAM, but they generally take up to a year because of failing certain points and having to come and retest. And most buildings that have gone through the certification process have taken at least a year to get certified, and that's one of the drawbacks, but also one of the strengths. In terms of testing performance and use, we've been looking at our projects that we've been working on with our clients and our own. I can't show all of our clients' data, but I can show some of our own. And as we indicated earlier, there's a significant reduction in absenteeism in a well-certified building. Whenever you move into a new building, you generally get on average in the UK about 25% reduction. We saw for our London office, the Crown Estates saw about 48%, we saw about 50%, and our Birmingham office, which was WELL Gold recently certified, saw 49% in their first year. So it's almost double the standard rate, and that can be significant. To Cundall, London, that equated to over £100,000 a year saving. Again, staff turnover was a big focus, and again, we demonstrated earlier the cost of that. And we had a fairly constant turnover in London until we moved into the new office, and that dropped by about 27% in that year. I'll caveat that was the year of the Brexit vote, so job security might have been an issue for some people. But just looking at those two metrics alone, we could be saving over 200k, and that doesn't even factor in attraction or productivity. Another thing which we've been trying to look at is qualitative data. So with our clients and for ourselves, what we do is pre and post occupancy surveys. It's really important to have a base case to demonstrate the improvement. So surveying the old offices. So here's our old office before we moved in terms of promoting our value, sense of community, pride in workspace. And you can see that after a year, all of those went significantly up in the new environment. And what was most interesting was the perceived wellness. That had gone up from just over 60 to just under 80%, which was a good improvement. But the biggest improvement came from that enjoyment of the environment from the staff. The staff feedback was great, and that was what I was talking about earlier, that engagement piece with the staff in order to bring them with you. But being engineers, what we actually found most interesting and where we get most excited about is the techie nerdy stuff. So we've installed sensors in all of our offices. When we actually started on this process, you can actually buy decent quality commercial ones. So we built them ourselves. Luckily, the market's caught up and there's lots of them now you can buy. But if you do want to buy them, maybe drop me a line, because they're varying quality for different things. Some of them are very good at certain things and they're very poor at other things. They're installed in now all of our 21 offices globally, and we're able to monitor minute by minute air quality and make improvements where needed. Why is this important? I'll demonstrate with a little example from our London office. So this is our London office here, the floor plate. We've got 5 sensors on the London floor plate. Don't worry about the bars at the top of the screen, just concentrate on the circles in the middle. That is showing CO2 concentrations. And when you design a building, you generally design for below 1,000 standard practice, best practice below 800. Ambient levels are around about 400. And as you can see here, at the beginning of the day, it's around about that 400 parts per million, and then it rises up. For the first year, this was really dull and boring. It kind of went up to 700, 800. And then this week happened, and you can see something went horrendously wrong. It went up to 13, 1400. And what actually happened was when we moved in, there was no tenant in occupation in the floor below us. This week, they refitted the floor below and rebalanced the ventilation. And when they rebalanced the ventilation, they basically robbed our fresh air and weren't providing us what they were contractually provided to do. If we hadn't have been monitoring that, we wouldn't have noticed that change. The fact that we were able to notice that change meant that we could go straight to the landlord and ask for our fresh air back. And within a few days, that was back down to the normal 800 and 700 parts per million. And you can say, well, what's the difference between 700 and 1400 parts per million? But there's been lots of research recently into the link between productivity and wellness, a lot driven by the BCO, which I've been involved in with Oxford Brookes Uni and Harvard University. And the reason they've been doing this, as we outlined earlier, is 90% of the cost of most businesses is people. So if you can make a few percent saving, it adds up. And what Harvard managed to demonstrate with a lab experiment was that they introduced different CO2 concentrations every day to a standardized office environment, and then gave at the end of the day cognitive performance tests, speed of reaction tests, and were able to show that there was a significant difference between 600 parts per million, 1,000 parts per million, and 2,500 parts per million. It varied by task, but for general typical office environment tasks, you could see about a 15% reduction at 1,500 parts per million, which is quite normal in a lot of offices that we've been monitoring over the last 2 years. And that got us to thinking, what else is affected by productivity? And we came up with things like temperature, comfort, air velocity, lighting, views out, all these things, acoustics, all these things have effect on productivity. And there's, for most of these things, there are academic research into those links. And as building designers and engineers, we're able to either test them in live buildings or actually simulate and predict them for new buildings and use them to dictate design decisions. So what we were able to do is produce a simulation tool which can look at every single workstation in an office and look to optimize performance. And what's really important here is we're not looking at an individual, we're looking at statistical average of the workstation and saying what an intervention will do. So you're never going to design a building which is perfect, but you can look at different design scenarios and see what the difference is and work out the difference in that productivity. So this is just an example looking at lighting and views out, so saying people near the windows with a view out have much better performance than those in the dark recesses of the building. We've been applying this now on projects, looking again at our own office in terms of daylighting, CO2 levels and vent and thermal comfort. We look at it for every workstation for every hour of the year, aggregate that across the year and work out the difference. And for the difference between our new and old office equated to 2.6%, which was in line with what we were talking about earlier in terms of small percentages. But when you aggregate that across the business and loss of revenue, that could equate to, for Cundall London, to over £520,000 a year. So it's a significant amount, which pays back fairly quickly when you start looking at interventions. We've also been applying it on live buildings where we've actually been going in and doing setting up sensors and doing staff surveys. And you can see here, this is a building where we've looked at the air temperature, and you can see the air temperature is good for 80 to 90% of the time, and that correlates with the feedback from the occupiers. It's got good air quality because of the level of filtration it's got. It's in good air quality for 95 to 100% of the time for most of the office. Where there was an issue was CO2. So you can see here that it was excellent for only 20% of the time, and it was considered to be high in some areas for over 60% of the time. That correlated with the occupant feedback, which said the space was stuffy. And when we ran this through our productivity tool, we were able to work out the loss of productivity every hour, statistical average. And it was quite often losing up to kind of 20% productivity for significant periods of the time. And when we worked at this across every single zone, we were able to see that most zones were losing around about 13 to 14% on their productivity just from CO2 alone. We're able to link this with daylight and thermal comfort and look at the floor plate. And you can see here that the more densely occupied area to the north of the building was performing significantly worse with kind of over 20% loss of productivity. By making a few recommendations to change the ventilation system and control setup, we were able to predict that they would improve their productivity by around about 6%. We've implemented those changes at a cost of about £50,000. And sorry, not £50,000, £5,500, and we're predicting that that's going to save the organisation over £2 million in productivity gains. Also, where we're starting to use the tool is in technical due diligence. So a lot of clients are coming to us asking us to review buildings, and now included in the matrix when we look at selection is the effect on productivity. So we're able to look at different buildings and say which building we think will make an organisation more productive in terms of their workspace and optimise it. So it's having significant use now and is actually starting to inform building design. So I think that's the end of the presentation. I think we open up to general questions now.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Well, thank you very much to all of our panel. That was really interesting conversation and some good points. We've had quite a few questions come through, which is really good. And if anyone still has a few, please feel free to ask, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So we've got one here from Colin, which I think we can probably open up to everyone, maybe more specifically Danny and Simon. So he says, what would you say is the best approach when encouraging speculative developers to go down the WellCore certification process? Open that to either of you.
I'll give Simon a little break. I think actually Simon's answered quite a lot of that question in his presentation. To be honest, I think if you can prove through technology that a well building is more productive, it certainly will let quicker. And the tenants are getting smarter than some of the design teams now. So they're quite demanding to have a good quality building, and I think they understand what a good quality building means. So I think the answer is it's competition. You need to be out there with a really good quality product, or you'll not let. It's pretty simple for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you said, kind of Simon covered most of that in his answer. There's another question here talking about the tension between wellbeing factors and the drive to achieve net zero carbon. So examples being for a greater duty on HVAC to deal with CO2 and humidity. So kind of open to all of you. How do we find a strike between that balance of the well-being versus the net zero carbon? Do you see there being much of a kind of a battle between the two?
It's a significant tension at the moment, which is being played out by a lot of design teams at the moment, and even with things like the BCO standard, where do you concentrate? There are contradictory messages. I think going forward, there's going to be a big focus on giving occupants control of their environments, both to reduce energy and to improve their comfort. There's lots of studies indicating people are willing to accept much worse conditions if they have a control over it. So, for example, most offices are cooled to 22 or 24 degrees, whereas if people have control of openable windows, they're willing to quite happily go up to 26, 27 degrees before they start complaining, and that's because they feel they have an element of control. So in order to reduce energy, there's also the requirement to reduce deadbands and things like that. Again, one of the big things we've seen from COVID is humidity. And again, this has been echoed by our research. We've been going into a lot of buildings and monitoring air quality, and we've seen predominantly the biggest issue being humidity levels being exceptionally low. And that leads to higher infection rates because the viruses aren't broken down. So we're seeing a lot of clients talk about humidification, which is energy intensive, which we don't normally do in the UK. So that is something that we're looking at, which may be problematic in the future. CO2, yes, ventilation is big, as I mentioned earlier. Demand control is the way to resolve that. And again, looking towards openable windows and natural ventilation as we electrify vehicles. So air quality should be improving in most urban areas going forward.
I think also just to add, Chris on here. So with some of the projects we're looking at the moment, there's this drive towards net zero carbon, and there's a lot of talk around solid facade and the impact on achieving net zero carbon, and that's fine, and I think that's clearly a huge priority. But what happens with the natural daylight and the conditions that we all sort of desire. So I think the tension is huge. And going back to Simon's point earlier, it does feel like net zero carbon is taking a front seat at the moment, and rightly so. It's a huge topic, but I think finding an equilibrium is probably key.
I just want to come on that. That's probably my biggest bugbear at the moment. With daylighting, we just need to be careful. Like historically, we've designed buildings using daylight factor, which is a very poor metric for daylight because it doesn't take into account direct sunlight, and it's basically just saying get as much as you can into the buildings. And it was done because we didn't have advanced modelling, and we couldn't do hourly simulations. Now that we can do hourly simulations, we use something called Useful Daylight Index, which basically says there's a maximum and a minimum, because we don't want glare. We don't want the blinds down constantly. So actually the best daylight generally is around about 50% of the facade, because then you're not having blinds down for significant periods of time, you're not experiencing glare. So designing for a well daylight space doesn't mean more glass, it means correctly targeted glass, evenly distributed throughout the space, and that is the starting point for both net zero carbon and well-being.
I would just go back to something that was mentioned earlier about this. There's a sort of technical tension between the two things, but I think there's also a collective desire to make them work. And I think what we're looking at more is we've got tenants who care about both of them things. Certainly well educated around net carbon zero, and certainly well educated around productivity and wellness. You know, there's something in partnering with your tenants to create that sort of focus on a topic, much like Simon was talking about in terms of just having somebody that cares seems to help. And I think if we do sort of collectively look after these two important things, I think we'll get better results rather than just sort of giving up space to a tenant and letting them get on with it. You know, let's partner with them, let's help them, let's them help us, and I think we'll get somewhere a bit quicker.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much for all of that. We've got a question here on COVID, I think, which was probably expected in kind of the current climate. So this one's actually targeted towards Danny and Simon, and it says, in the light of the current backdrop, what's your thoughts around COVID-19 and how that will impact on wellbeing in the workplace? So there, for example, they're quoting the rise of remote working, social distancing and social interactions. So kind of how do you see that changing kind of over the future, if at all?
I mean, I think it's already had an impact, hasn't it? It's and I do think we've got to be careful that we don't have too much of a knee-jerk reaction to things. We don't know an awful lot about it. It's been sort of 5 or 6 months of research, so we're doing sort of everything we can in terms of technical things that Simon spoke about, fresh air and air quantities, which is the right way to go, I think. But I think it's already changing. We've seen well come out with a sort of health safety rating fairly recently, and that's sort of targeted towards COVID and beyond, I suppose. But I think the office space is, in my mind, a sort of a nurturing space in many ways, and I think perhaps it'll become more so where it becomes much more of a collaboration space, and you do the sort of hard yards back home, and perhaps you don't go into the office all the time, but there's certainly a place for an office. But I think, you know, just if you think about some of the really vulnerable people in society, they might never want to go back to the office again, actually, if we don't get a significant sort of move forward in a vaccine. And, you know, thinking about, you know, if we picture ourselves in a few years' time, we haven't got a vaccine, but lots of people have antibodies. How do we look at unvaccinated people, or you know, people who haven't had it? Or, you know, there's a lot of sort of stress still related around that, and a lot of sort of mental health. And I wonder if what will happen, it will become much more mental health related, rather than sort of necessarily physical health. Because I think, and I guess that takes me on to sort of a bugbear of mine, if you like. Wellness is very much focused on a body of people who work in offices. What we have seen quite maybe a surprisingly light-footedness around construction workers still operating within a COVID environment, and them companies taking a real sort of stand on wellness. And we haven't really focused on the wellness of construction sites. We seem very focused on the wellness of people who spend money and let nice offices. So I would sort of, you know, encourage this sort of look at the site and how they've evolved, and how we deal with the mental health around all of that stress and anxiety about returning to work. So I think, but you know, going back to your point, I think there already has been a change in office. I don't think it's quite come to its conclusion, but I think we're doing a reasonably good job of that.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that. We've just got a question here in terms of kind of the procurement and contractual point of view. So it says, how are the client's well requirements and responsibility for securing the well features communicated in practical terms? So can a contractor be expected to burden the risk for factors potentially outside of their control?
Yeah, sure. This is a really important piece, and it's the same with all sustainability. It's really important to get it in as early as possible into the design process and into the procurement process. So we're working with a lot of clients to embed this at REBA stage 0 into their standard design standards, so that when they're appointing professional staff, that it's included in their contracts, their requirements, and again when they're going out to tender for construction, it's included in the contractor's requirements what they need to do, and then they're able to support them for their delivery. Again, it should be broken up as BREEAM or LEEDAR to contractor client credits and design team credits. But what's really important is it's about performance and use. So it's basically each of the requirements has a owner at each REBA stage who basically takes it forward through that REBA stage, ensures that it's achieved, and then hands it on at the next REBA stage to the correct person. And that probably, on most accounts, will go from design team to contractor, but that has to be managed and handled right. You can't just leave it to stage 4 or 5 when the contractor's on board and hope they're going to solve it. It has to be thought about from REBA stage 1. How are you going to achieve that performance and use?
That's a really good point. It does not have to become a contentious contractual issue. It needs to be set out at the very start of the project, and competent technical designers like Simon and the MEP community can do pre-assessments and have a very good understanding of where a scheme is going to roughly end up on a set of scoring, and that can be done, and then managed. Client expectations can be managed accordingly, so the client roughly knows where their building is going to finish up, and then it just goes into the tender pack like any other obligation for the contractor to do. And it's an iterative process. It's not start at stage 2 and forget about it until you're on site. It needs to be done all the way through the project, and that's where consultants like Simon really add value to the process.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Simon, there's one probably just a small kind of technical one for you. So from your perspective, can you clarify the difference between well-enabled and well-core?
Yeah, sure. So it's an interesting one. When Well actually came out, version 1, there wasn't a Well, Shall and Core, but they realised they'd missed a opportunity to make money. So they quickly introduced it. But a lot of us are carrying on with what they originally intended, which was Well enabled. So Well, Shall and Core doesn't cover all 120 features. It probably covers about 80% of the features. It doesn't cover the things like the mental well-being and how you operate the building. It just looks at the building asset and you get certified. What we've found is almost all the benefit is associated with the tenant. So there's not a lot of developers don't want to pay for that cost when the tenant gets all the benefits. So what they're doing is looking at how they can support the tenant. And there's 2 versions of Well enabled. One is doing a Well, Shall and Core where you do all the measures but don't get certified, which has benefit, and it basically means you have a healthy building. What we found to be more useful is if the developer looks at the fit out requirements and secures as many of those credits as possible before a tenant comes on board. So when the tenant comes on board and they want to target their own well certification, the landlord is able to hand them a pack of information and say, this is 30% of your credits already secured for you, which we've achieved for you. So there's kind of 2 ways of doing it. We're working with people to do kind of both ways.
Brilliant, that's fantastic, thank you. Sorry, just conscious of time as we're sort of coming towards the end of our hour now. So I'd just like to thank the panel very much for your time this evening. It's been part of a really interesting discussion and debate on the well topic, and hopefully all the attendees who logged on found it insightful as well. Following the live event, we'll be able to share the recording round for those who want to watch it again or share it onwards. And finally, as well, just as part of this event is part of a bigger series. We're excited to say the next Alinea Forum, which is coming soon, hopefully to be in September, is actually going to be based on the Alinea market report. We've only just begun, obviously looking at everything that's happened in the last well, really the last 6 months. So we'll be issuing out invites for that shortly. So keep your eyes out for that, and we hope to see you there. But thank you very much again to all the panel, and thank you for your attendees for your time. Have a great evening, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night, all.